Well, hello and welcome back to our study as we're going through 40 different days in the life of Jesus. The events that I'm about to describe to you were certainly events that would have constituted one of the darker days of Jesus' ministry. We know it was a day that had a tremendous impact on him and on the disciples as well. Of course, I'm referencing the death of John the Baptist and the things that occurred around that. Before we take a hard look into this story, I want us to just catch up on a few facts. This whole series we were in began with Jesus being baptized by John at the Jordan River. It was a powerful study, and it was a moment where we had a real glimpse into the attitude of John. John, who could say, I have to decrease, Jesus has to increase. And we really built on that a lot, on that attitude. We know that there had been some connection as Jesus was starting his ministry. John had continued to be a person of influence in the region. He was preaching and he was continuing to point people towards Jesus. But as he was doing so, he was also speaking to a lot of the issues of morality in his day. One of the issues that John spoke about frequently was something that happened right in his own backyard. And that was that Herod, the ruler there, had actually been involved in the murder of his wife, and then in bringing in another person who he had as a mistress. And John was critical of these events that had occurred, and he named them. Herod was very upset by this, as especially was Herodias, the woman who was his consort now. So John was arrested, and he spends time with Herod, and as he's in this space and he's put in prison, he would occasionally go before Herod to speak, and Herod was quite mesmerized by John the Baptist. However, the woman that he was with, Herodias, despised him. She didn't want their sin being called out, and she didn't want John to speak to that issue of immorality. In this way, John was a forerunner of our own time. We live in an age where we don't want to consider anything really a sin anymore. It's just a bad choice or a bad decision, but we don't want to call things sinful. I think John would have a lot to say about many of the issues of our time. Well, having said that, I want us to dive into the biblical text, because it's really more important what the Bible says than what I say anyway. Here's what we learn in the book of Mark, the 6th chapter, beginning in verse 17. It said, Herod himself had given orders to have John arrested. He had him bound, and he had him put in prison. Now, last week you will recall that as we were looking at the sending out of the 12 disciples, or apostles we said, because that's what the word apostle literally means, the sent ones, and Jesus was sending them out. So the 12 had gone out on an evangelistic mission, but before they had left, Jesus had given them instructions and warnings. And one of his warnings was, listen, you're going to get handed over to the rulers, and you'll even face death on account of me. Now, while that didn't happen to any of the 12, those words surely would have been ringing in their ears. And when they learn of the events that happen here in Mark chapter 6, it must have been a very sobering, a very somber moment for each of them, as they realized the things Jesus was saying were absolutely true. Well, let's pick up the story. And it says at the end of verse 17 that the reason for John's imprisonment was because of Herodias, who had been his brother Philip's wife, whom he had married. For John had been saying to Herod, and I want you to understand something, John had said this by all appearances directly to Herod. It wasn't that he was talking about someone else's business publicly, although there are plenty of people who think that's the case here. But John had confronted Herod directly, and I think it had had an impact on him. And it had caused a wave or a rift in his relationship with his new consort, Herodias. So, John had told him, it's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. And because of this, verse 19 tells us, Herodias nursed a grudge. Now, I could make a big aside here and share how dangerous it is for any of us to nurse a grudge. A grudge says that I want things to turn out the way I want, and I'm unwilling to accept this person having anything good happen in their life whatsoever. I only want bad for them. And that's the grudge that she has against John the Baptist. And we'll see for her, it is a grudge that the only way she'll be happy is if he's dead. What a horrible thing to wish that you wish that for someone. But this is the black heart of Herodias. And she wanted to kill John, but she wasn't able to. Now we have to assume that so far, Herod, because he has an affinity for John, has been able to keep John alive. And whatever plots or schemes that she had come up with, he had been able to keep them from being implemented. But not so in this occasion now. As we'll see, there's a devastating end of the story. She had not been able to do anything to John so far because Herod, it says in verse 20, feared John. And it was Herod who was protecting him because Herod deep down knew he was a righteous and holy man. In fact, when Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, yet he liked to listen to him. Like our adversary, the devil, Herodias was always looking for a moment of weakness. She was always looking for a gap that she could cause to divide further and widen into a crack. And she finds that here at an event where it is vain boasting that will be the undoing of Herod and literally the death of John the Baptist. Here's what happens. It says that she finally found her opportune time, for the opportune time came. It was on his birthday that Herod gave a banquet for his high officials and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. Now, I want you to note that it was for the men. This was an all-guys party, and it was pretty wild, by all measures, a pretty wild party that they had going on. His wife, we know from the end of the story, wasn't invited. There were probably no women who had been invited, save the entertainment. And not to dwell too much on debauchery, but it was very common in this period for them to have a prostitute or more than one prostitute who would come and who would dance in a very inappropriate and voluptuous way. Well, this is what happens in the story. And to help us understand a little bit about the vileness of Herodias, the dancer that will come won't be a prostitute. It will be her own daughter, who she will use to bring about her evil plan in the story. So it says that as they were all gathered together, Herod and all of his military commanders and the leading men of Galilee, that the daughter of Herodias herself came in and she danced for them. And whatever she danced and however she danced, it was of such a motivation for these men that Herod feels moved to say to his dinner guest, ask me for anything that you want, he says to this girl in front of all of his friends. Ask me for anything you want and I will give it to you. And he promised her with an oath, and this was the oath, whatever you ask, I will give you up to half of my kingdom. Now, you've heard oaths like this before that have been spoken throughout Scripture, and they're always disastrous. And here we have such a moment for Herod. He asked for this, and we can read in the other accounts of the story that the daughter of Herodias, Salome, she then leaves the room so she can go out where her mother is. And she tells her mother everything that's happened. She says, well, Mom, what am I supposed to ask for? And it's in this moment that Herodias' plan comes full circle. And she says, well, ask him for the head of John the Baptist. Now, there's a loyalty that this young lady has, and it's to her mom. It was probably at her mother's urging that she danced, and now it is at her mother's urging that she makes this request. And I want to delicately just say that there's a high creep factor in this story. That he is so pleased by the dancing of his stepdaughter in an erotic way that he gives her this gift. I'm not going to go any further with it, just to say this was a disturbed and pretty messed up situation. At once she comes back to the king and she says, I want you to give me right now the head of John the Baptist on a platter. What a gruesome thing to ask for. Herod could not have imagined that this is what she would have asked for. And indeed, because he's been boasting of what he would give, honor now demands that he is a man of his word, so to speak. And he finds himself now in Herodias' trap. And so it is that he is the one now who will give this order. He was greatly distressed, it says, but because of his oaths and his dinner guest, he did not want to refuse her. So he immediately sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. The man went. He beheaded John in the prison. He brought back his head on a platter. He presented it to the girl, and she gave it to her mother. It's a macabre and grisly story. It is a story of John, who's been speaking the truth, paying the ultimate price. And it's a harbinger or a forerunner, right? John's purpose given by God was to run ahead of Jesus. And now John is the forerunner in death, giving his life for the truth that he preached. Now, when this is made known, John's disciples come. They take his body and they lay it in a tomb. And of course, it's not very long after this that they come to Jesus, and that Jesus receives the news of John's death, though certainly he had already perceived it. This also had to be a troubling moment for the apostles. Things were getting more serious. People were dying for their beliefs, for their faith. Given that Jesus had already predicted similar things would happen to them, this must have been a gut check. This must have been one of those moments where they seriously wondered, what is this thing that we're into? One of my concerns today in the world is that we like to send a message about how faith in Jesus Christ makes your life better, how you can sleep better at night and enjoy more peace. And I do think there's some truth in all of those things. But I also want you to understand in this hard lesson tonight that there can be a cost for following Jesus. Do you know that we'll learn subsequent to this, or after this rather, that all of the disciples will give their life because of Jesus. Only John has a fate that's not completely known, although tradition says that John dies a martyr's death. Jesus' words were always true. They are always true. Following Jesus isn't always easy. And sometimes, as many, many Christians have observed through the ages, it is being faithful even unto death. I told you this was a heavy day in the life of Jesus, and it's kind of a heavy day in our study and in our story. Doing the right thing sometimes comes at a great price. And for John, the price was his life. For Jesus, the price was his life. Jesus hinted at something, that for us too, there is a taking up of our cross, an understanding that this isn't a commitment that says, I'm committed to Jesus as long as things go well and nothing can hurt me. Our commitment to Jesus is to be one that says, I'm committed to Jesus no matter what. And I understand that it could cost me something. Well, I know these are somber and sobering words. They were somber and sobering to his disciples. We speculated last week on what it was that brought them back to Jesus. there's a good possibility that it was this event that brings them back to Jesus, maybe even earlier than they had anticipated coming back. They wanted to hear what Jesus thought, and they wanted to be with their friend as they knew his cousin had died. This was the end of this powerful story. Now, I don't want to give too much away about next week, but I do want you to think ahead to something. Even though there were horrible things happening, even though Jesus is overwhelmed with grief and sadness, in spite of all of that, he is joyful at the reports that the disciples will bring back about the things that they accomplished on their time that they had been sent away in ministry. And he will still be able to be compassionate, even though he himself is suffering greatly. And it had to be for Jesus a moment where he has this confirmation that John has been the forerunner and the foreshadower of things to come. And the prophecies and the things that Jesus is on a mission to do, they will come to pass. And he too will suffer a horrible death. And he is facing that more and more. These are the things that will lead him in that garden that night to pray the words, "Father, if there's any other way, take this cup from me. But not my will, but thine be done." Following Jesus isn't always easy, but following Jesus is always worth it. I hope you'll continue to tune in and to listen as we go through these different days in the life of Jesus. Today I've kind of only given you a glimpse into one rough day where a horrible event happened, but this was a day that is going to be quite a lengthy one for Jesus. We have reason to believe that on the same day that the messengers arrived to Jesus with this news, that's also when the disciples begin to return, and some other really important events begin to happen in his ministry, including the feeding of the 5,000. But I've said enough about this day so far. Thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to hearing you and seeing you back with us again at our next session.